Velkommen alle sammen. Who would win in a fight, a Viking or a knight? This is a response to Skallagrim's video on the subject, and I've got a very different take, as you guys may see. First of all, let me say, I like Skallagrim, I've followed his content for years, and I think he's a super knowledgeable guy, and his name even comes from one of my favorite Viking heroes, Skallagrim, the father of Egil from Egil's saga, an absolute beast of a man. So I am not here to bash the guy, but he said that a Viking would lose to a knight every time, and that is a complete load of shit, even if the Viking just had a wolf pelt to wear and nothing else. For two reasons the Viking would win, and that's what we're covering in this video. Also, you guys can check out the online shop, fully functional Viking Age and Migration Period replicas back in stock. These are made to order in the Czech Republic for pro, HEMA, and Buhurt fighters, so they are in limited availability usually. They only come in stock every 2 or 3 months, so check those out if you like. So, for the video, we're going to break this down in 3 situations, 3 scenarios. A 1 versus 1 duel, Viking versus knight. An army versus army battle, large-scale warfare, and under special conditions. So 1. Open, traditional warfare. This is where I give it to the knights. No question, no arguments from me there. If you put 10,000 knights against 10,000 Vikings in a traditional, open battlefield, the knights win 100% of the time. They had better armor, better training, better swords, better cavalry, better battlefield tactics. They were essentially tanks, no argument from me there. Knights were made for open warfare, and in that setting, they dominate. But here's the thing, even with the improved weapons that came with everybody during the late medieval era, long after the Viking Age, a battle like that would be pure fantasy, because armies were not made up of all knights or all Vikings. Both sides would have been 80-90% regular people, freemen, levies, local fighters with basic gear, axes, spears, and minimal armor, and that changes everything. But still, an average Viking army with tools such as these versus an average middle-aged army incorporating knights. Knights win 100 battles out of 100. Fair. Part 2, a 1 versus 1 duel. This is where I absolutely disagree with Skallagrim. Yes, knights had better armor, chainmail, padding underneath even. They had formal training, they had schools of swordsmanship, but guess what? None of that matters once the fight gets rough. And all of these LARPer guys especially, or fencers, or guys from traditional martial arts, but even HEMA guys too, they wildly overestimate the effectiveness of better weapons, armor, and swordsmanship. Buhurt guys, on the other hand, are all going to agree with me. What is actually effective in a real fight is far more complicated. So guess what? The Viking, if he's outclassed by the weapons and swordsmanship of the knights, he's not just gonna stand there trading pokes at the knight until he gets caught a few times and bleeds out. No, if the Viking started losing, he would charge forward, clinch up, and that would be game over for the knight. And this is where people underestimate the Vikings. They were wrestlers, they were grapplers. Just look at me here, I am brand new to this type of training. I'm going up against some advanced guys and they are kicking my ass. But really, it's really not that hard to close the distance, even with a smaller and inferior Sikhs that I'm using here. It's not that hard to rush forward at the right moment, clinch up, and then the Sikhs is actually better, and the sword and the knight's armor is basically useless when it gets this close. Also, I fought at the Legion Sports Fest last week and I saw some of these pro armored combat guys. It's the exact same thing. It turns into a grappling match very, very quickly. Now I know what you're all thinking, oh well, the knights could wrestle too. Yeah, it's true. We have a few rare sources in medieval manuscripts that cover wrestling techniques, and even a couple famous wrestlers of the Middle Ages that we know trained knights. Knights would have known some wrestling techniques. I'm not saying they didn't wrestle, but Vikings grew up wrestling. It was part of their daily life, their entertainment, their social life, okay? So suggesting that a knight could hang with a Viking in wrestling is like saying your average kid in America who wrestled in high school could hang with a regular average kid from Dagestan, okay? Brother, send him Dagestan 2-3 years and forget. It's a different level, okay? Anyone watching who has wrestled their whole life, just tell us below in the comments how easily you would ragdoll a regular high school or even a college wrestler. A knight who, in between his horseback riding and swordsmanship lessons and having his serf help him get dressed up all pretty for dinner banquets, maybe in between trained a little wrestling once every blue moon. That is a big difference from a Viking who grew up wrestling since he could walk. He grew up feral. He played games like Knatleiker, a rough ball game where takedowns were involved. They wrestled livestock for fun. They wrestled underwater when they tried to drown each other for sport. At every single high festival, all thing, every party, every gathering in the Viking Age, wrestling and other games would have been practiced there. The culture of grappling in the Viking Age and the medieval Knight Age, not even close. Have you ever heard of glima? That is literally Viking grappling. The rules of glima are made for war, just like many other traditional wrestling styles around the world. It's not like American folk style where you take the guy down and see how long you can hump him for. No, you only score in glima if you take the guy down while you are standing above him. Again, it's mocking the war aspect so you can stab his lights out standing over him while you're on top of him. Stab with a seax or dagger through small holes in the armor, bite his throat out like Egil does in the sagas. This is war. It's not a fencing match like some people want to suggest. And wearing 60 pounds of armor does not help you one bit when you're flat on your back and someone is standing over you with a knife ready to stab your lights out. Also worth noting, the Vikings that we read about in the sagas were primarily of the upper class. They were chieftains' sons, they were royalty, they were just kind of the nobility in society. So they would have been a little bit more well-fed. In the sagas, they were farmers, they were landowners, they had plenty of livestock. And in the Viking Age, it was actually a more abundant and warmer climate than the medieval period. The average height actually dropped a little bit during the Middle Ages due to famine, colder weather, and disease. So yes, probably your average Viking was likely bigger and stronger than your average knights, even though the knights were also nobility and they would have been well fed. But even if they were the same size, you're comparing a feral wolf to a pampered noble. One lived to raid, wrestle, and survive. The other trained in a palace or in a fortress with tutors and had peasants help them get dressed. I'm not saying knights were wimps here, quite the opposite. Knights were badasses. They were the biggest and toughest of the time, and they were brave, and they had some epic feats, did some epic battles, and there was great honor in being a knight, but they were not Vikings. Again, a knight, better equipped and trained in swordsmanship, but Viking had some armor too. They wouldn't have just been naked. The knight wouldn't be just able to poke at a Viking and kill him with one shot before the Viking can clinch up. It's that same delusion that boxers in the modern day say. They say, oh, I can beat a wrestler in a fight, I'll just knock him out with one punch when he shoots in for a takedown. No, you won't. This is coming from a boxer, by the way, a kickboxer and a boxer who didn't pick up wrestling till later in life. Maybe the striker gets lucky and lands a KO shot every once in a while, but almost every time the wrestler wins. So, in a 1 versus 1 duel, I'm giving it knight loses to a Viking 95 times out of 100. So now that that is taken care of, let's talk about non-traditional battlefields. Forests, rough landscapes, rocky beaches, mountains, wherever. Vikings win. They're faster, they're agile, and they're not dragging around 100 pounds of armor. They would have had some fur on maybe, some leather, maybe even some light plates around the torso, but they would get around much easier in any rugged terrain. Vikings win there. Raids, guerrilla warfare, Vikings win. They climb walls, they sneak in, they'd fight like animals. The knight wouldn't even hear them coming, and they certainly couldn't catch them. A perfect example would be like the raid you see in the Northman movie. I don't care if the Vikings were naked and the knights had full armor on. Vikings climb the walls, they run around like feral hounds while the knights are lugging themselves around, trying to keep up. And they wouldn't be able to even see or hear two Vikings coming up from behind them and slashing his throat through his armor. Vikings win every time in raids and guerrilla warfare. How about sea battles? Naval warfare, come on, not even close. Knights in plate armor on a wooden ship, not a very good idea. Again, just sneak up behind them, throw them overboard, lights out. The Vikings lived on boats most of their battles. Best and biggest battles were fought on boats. Vikings win every time in naval warfare. At night, in the dark, with stealth, with chaos, burning buildings going around, the Vikings win every time. I don't think the knight would be very subtle in his shining armor, and clanking every time he takes a step. But when we go to more sort of traditional warfare and battles, cavalry, okay, yeah, any battle that involved cavalry, the knights win. Ranged weapons, the knights beat the Vikings there too, of course. They had much better ranged weapons and technology. Siege warfare, okay, yeah, definitely knights win in that fight there. And any type of more traditional battle like that, traditional warfare, the knights are going to beat the Vikings in that scenario. But you gotta understand, of course, this is going to happen. That's what knights are, that's how they evolved. The technology of armor and weapons of the knights was literally developed that way, not necessarily because it was better or superior in every way, but it's just because that is how warfare evolved by that point in history. Large-scale armies in a battlefield, cavalry, siege warfare, that kind of stuff. And in that type of warfare, the knights were the most terrifying force of war maybe ever in history. An incredible development of European military technology and bravery and badassery that forged the world as we know it today. Without that technology, the world wouldn't be as we know it today. The knight was the ultimate weapon of the time. But in a dream world, or possibly in another historical context, it very easily could have happened. Warfare could have evolved differently from the Viking Age to the Middle Ages. More guerrilla warfare, more naval warfare like that, and if that happened, we may have never seen knights in history. If naval warfare became more popular, for example, we would have seen much more advanced ships and projectiles at sea in the Middle Ages, and we wouldn't have even seen a knight in shining armor. So remember, it's not that the knight's equipment and technology is superior in every way, it's just that it was superior for that type of warfare in that time period. Same thing when guns were invented, the knights basically disappeared overnight. So the final verdict: open battlefield with formation fighting, traditional warfare, knights win. 1 versus 1 duel that turns into a brawl, a fight to the death, Vikings win. In forest raids, sea battles, ambushes, guerrilla warfare, Vikings win. And knights win in other open warfare, cavalry, siege, and so on. They were elite soldiers on their battlefield, but that was not the only battlefield. So thanks for watching. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, especially if you train HEMA or Buhurt or wrestling. I'd like to hear your take, and I'm even going to take it a bit more seriously myself now, train a little bit more, maybe try to compete, and also check out the training swords that I've got in the shop. But that's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.